Yes, we're live.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone.
Andrew.
Hi there.
Well, I'd like to welcome everybody. This is the concluding talk of the Berlage's series entitled Architectures of Speculation. This semester, we've been considering architecture's historical and contemporary relationship to real estate speculation, from urban developments associated with 19th century London, the end of 19th century Paris and post-war Rome, to issues of land ownership, the spatial ordering of property, and buildings as financial instruments. We're pleased to have architectural historian Andrew Saint to conclude the series. We have asked him to speak, well, originally on Cubit's London, because I was quite interested in that as Cubit's as a developer, and Andrew came back with a proposal to use part of the work that he's currently doing on 19th century London, exploring how the city was the biggest in the world and how it developed its housing in various different typological directions before eventually abandoning terrace housing, except at the low end of the market. Andrew's talk will also touch on how and why London embraced the apartment building after 1880, and as why London is so strongly associated with the terrace type. Well, in fact, it can be found in many European and American cities. Formerly the general editor of the Survey of London for over a decade, or nearly a decade, Andrew's books include Richard Norman Shaw, The Image of the Architect, which is one of my personal favorites, and also along with Architect and Engineer, a study in sibling rivalry. He is currently completing a short book on London between the years 1870 and 1914. Well, at any rate, it's a pleasure to give you the screen, Andrew, and we look forward to your talk. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Simon. Can everybody hear me properly? Of course, you don't really get a proper answer in Zoom. Good, that's very good. Well, I'll bash on. I find to my amazement that I've been living in London for 50 years now. I don't mind admitting that I find my city as fascinating now as I ever did. And I have no plans to leave, despite Brexit, COVID, the desertion of a few old friends to the countryside, and a rash of absolutely dreadful new tall buildings about which I might just say a word at the end of the talk. I suppose all great cities breed their fans and their habitués, and I suppose too that everyone of that kind feels there is something secret about their city, something that tourists don't see or understand, and they're at least half glad about that. I certainly feel that about London. Not, I like to think, without justification, because in many ways, London really is more various than most other European cities. In part, there's a simple reason for that, which Salomon referred to. It's just bigger than the rest of them, with the one exception which people usually forget, which is Moscow, which is bigger than London. It spreads, anyhow, London spreads and it sprawls, let's see, in unpredictable kinds of ways. And its suburbs are often as attractive as its centre, if not more so. There was a theory about that, which you don't hear so much these days. And it used to be said that London has never really had any proper planning like Paris or Barcelona or Berlin, that it's simply a collection of villages which got connected as the city grew. I never find that quite satisfactory, chiefly perhaps because wherever one goes within, say, 10 kilometres of Trafalgar Square, there's something that binds the fabric of London together in a loose but definite way. And it's that I'm talking to you about this lunchtime. And I'll talk pretty exclusively about terrace houses, though, as Solomon says, I'll say a little bit of a word about flats. In the later part of the lecture, I'll come across other building types to some degree, all about housing. The peculiar nature of London's housing, which I'm here to talk about, is really this terrace house, or as the Americans would call it, the row house. That's what you call it, Salomon, I've no doubt. It's a type that's far from unique to London, but it's been successful there to an extent which is hardly paralleled elsewhere. The Terrace House continues to be the workhouse of London's housing, useful, flexible, and generally popular. It's also remarkably varied in its scale and its looks. Before I get into its history, I'd like to give you a little bit of a taste of its variety. I live about a mile south of the Thames in a district called Kensington. It's one of the inner suburbs of London, not to be confused with Kensington with an S in the middle. This is the crescent you're looking at now, which I live in. The houses are just 2 stories high, fronted in a bright orange-red brick. Each is 2 windows wide, and some of them are crowned with little gables. I have a Dutch friend who often comes to visit me. When she first came, she was amazed, she says, to find something that looked like a back street from Delft. You can't guess these houses. It's 1913, only a little bit more than a century ago. They were built for artisans. That means the upper working classes in English parlance, and they had originally just a front room, a kitchen and a scullery, a bijkeuken in Dutch, on the ground floor, and 3 small bedrooms upstairs. Nowadays, most of these houses, like mine, have been sold off to the middle classes, who have often knocked the rooms on both floors together to make more space. Families are much smaller now, of course, but they need more gear, more equipment than the people did when these houses were built. These little houses are very much sought after and have gone up in value by at least 3 times since I came to live here in the 1990s. Round the corner from where I'm speaking to you from is a main road, Kensington Road. The houses you see here are much older than the Dutch-looking houses you saw before. They date from around the 1770s and 80s, and they're more the kind of thing people associate with the London Terrace House. They're taller, they have basements, which I want to come back to later. You don't see them very well in these pictures. And they have fairly deep front gardens, unlike the houses you previously saw, which fronted pretty well up to the street. In fact, the gardens in front here were once much deeper because they looked onto a main road, which would have been much dustier before the invention of tarmac. And one of the points of the long gardens to terrace houses in London on the main roads is to shield the houses from the dust of the road, which the gravel of the roads threw up. As traffic increased, the main road was widened. As you see at the top, it's now a pretty wide road, and the gardens were correspondingly cut back. So that, even so, they're quite long for front gardens in London today. Then they're long enough in some places, rather curiously, to attract shops in front of them of the kind you see here. And this is quite a characteristic London view. One of the games you can play in London is going along a main road on the top of a bus and spotting the old houses still remaining behind shop fronts, which you can't see much of from ground level. Even today, the surviving gardens along Kensington Road are still longer than average for the suburban London house, which often has a decent back garden, but only a pretty small area in front. Most of these pocket-sized front gardens are pretty boring, but occasionally someone decides to liven them up, as you can see from the examples here. To go back to the Kensington Road houses, you'll have seen that the fronts of these houses are pretty sober. They're just a set of plain boxes fronted in the local London brick, normally called stock brick. The only architectural features you sometimes find in houses of this kind is an ornamental surround or door hood, or perhaps a pretty pattern in lead over the door, called in English a fanlight. Looks like a fan. In the old days, when art historians decided for us what is architecture and what is mere building, houses like these were hardly considered architecture. Nowadays, most of us are not so sure of the distinction, or maybe we're just more interested these days in what is just building. Adding ornament inside or out is one way by which essentially banal buildings of any kind can be construed as becoming architecture. The other, and maybe more interesting way, is when these houses, which in the 18th century tended to be built in ones or twos or threes, were drawn together in a single composition. You see that in the group of the Kensington Road houses you've got here, where 3 houses in a long terrace are brought together under a single pediment. This kind of device often, as here, not specially sophisticated, began to emerge from the 1770s or so. I'll go into this in a bit more detail later. Finally, in this opening section about houses in my neighbourhood, here is a square which is just across the road from my house. It's now called Cleaver Square, but it used, as you can see from the map, called Prince's Square. That map dates from the 1890s, I think. You can also see from the map that the square sits in a broader sea of terrace houses, all of which have rather ugly little back extensions sticking out behind them, usually lower than the main houses, and back gardens of different sizes, some fairly long, as you see on the south side of the square, some rather short, as you see from the street behind it, which is Methley Street. Cleaver Square dates mostly, I think, from the 1840s. Like most London squares, it isn't square at all. In fact, it's a bottle shape. And the houses around it, as you can see here, are in a variety of styles. One's got basements here, the other one hasn't, which is more advanced. And because it was quite in the suburbs there, it didn't need to squeeze up so much space. Basements gradually go out in London after about 1870. So you can see one's got stucco on and the other one hasn't. That's also a sign of it being later. If you look at the street behind, Methley Street, which I mentioned, it's much more regular, in part because it's a bit later, the 1870s or 80s or something like that. It was probably built, this one, more or less in one go. As the 19th century went on, the financing of building construction became more sophisticated, and builders could often put up a whole street in a very few years, which wasn't the case 50 years before. So much then by way of introduction to the variety of what you can see in a fairly average district of London. You might call them the inner suburbs. Now for a bit of history. How did these houses come about? The first thing to say is that there's nothing unique at all to London about this typology. Imagine the main street in any medieval village in Northern Europe, particularly the picture on the bottom right here, it's a village in Germany. What you find is a series of timber houses jammed end on to the road with very little room between them in order to maximize their number as space becomes a premium. The house type is usually much the same in the village as in the countryside. You could see a typical English, South English house at the top left there, just sitting on its own. But in the case of the ones in the villages and the towns, they're turned end on into the street. In the English version of the timber houses, whether in the country or in the town, a common plan form is to have a stair going up in the middle between two rooms you see on the bottom left here. That goes on to become the commonest plan form of the London brick terrace house when it first appears in the 17th century. It's simply the old type of timber house refaced in brick. It's very important, I think, to understand that when brick comes in, it doesn't replace timber, it just clothes it over these kinds of houses, as you see on the left here. Brick had several advantages over timber, in particular more fireproof, much more so than the imported softwoods, which were increasingly being used in building London's houses. Brick allowed houses to get extra space at the sides by the device of a shared brick so-called party wall between one house and the house next door. The party wall rising slightly above the roofs to prevent the spread of fire from one house to the next becomes a distinctive feature of the London terrace house. Brick also needed not much maintenance, whereas timber elevations needed plastering, which had to be painted or renewed fairly often. The result of the urban brick revolution, which 17th century London shared with Amsterdam, you see on the right here, and many other European cities, were that houses became encased in brick on the outside, usually with tiles. Again, you see here on the picture on the left, there's a tile roof in place of the earlier thatch. Inside, the floors, roofs and finishings remained of timber construction. The brick was used not to replace the timber, I emphasize that, but to protect it. There's a rather curious picture showing a house in dilapidation in the East End of London. The whole front walls come off, and what you see, at least for the upper stories, it's a complete timber house, really. And now let's go back to some 17th century houses. Here are two early examples of these kinds of new houses, which becoming common in and around London in the first 60 years of the 17th century. On the left is an example which isn't particularly well known. It's a group at a place called Newington Green, an informal kind of nucleus of village or something like that, several miles from the centre of London in one of those outlying communities I mentioned, which eventually got absorbed into the city. Rather interestingly, we know that these houses date from 1658, and it's interesting to see that already by then, what was essentially a new urban type had already spread to an outlying suburb. The picture on the right is of a much more famous development. It's the famous Covent Garden Piazza, which is normally held to be the origin of the London Square. Not really talking about squares in this talk, I'm talking about the houses themselves. We can talk a bit about squares if you like in the discussion. These houses you see on the right, around two sides of the piazza, were designed by Inigo Jones, the King's architect, in the 1630s. This is definitely architecture with a capital A, as opposed to the ones on the left, which are architecture with a lower A, I suppose. Yet these are actually collections of what we could call terrace houses, albeit for the richest classes, pulled together over an open portico and made to look rather like a palazzo. The most obvious precedent for this composition is the Place des Vosges in Paris at the bottom right, a reminder again that there was nothing particular to London about this kind of game. The next stage was, however, more unique to London. In 1666 occurred the famous Great Fire, the aftermath of which occasioned an enormous building effort. This was also the period when London began to draw away from Paris and Amsterdam in commercial growth and size, though not by any means in elegance. It's the period of the invention of much of the modern capitalist system in banking and insurance. It was also the period when houses became a commodity. In other words, not just places to build and live in, but items to buy and sell. The consequence was that house building in London went on to a kind of production line. It was stripped down more or less to essentials and became the same everywhere. The age of what we call the speculative builder had begun. And that's the kind of brick carcass which I showed you in the Kensington Road. And here are some more examples on the left from Summerson's Georgian London. This kind of house could be put up fairly fast, and it could be anything from 1 story high to 5 or 6, and in width from 2 to 5 windows. It's an entirely anonymous kind of architecture. It went through various mutations over the years, mainly in response to changes in the building regulations. In fact, you could say that the London Terrace house is merely the building regulations translated into bricks and mortar. It's not really a design thing at all. This typology became enduringly successful, so much so that the post-fire type of the 1660s is still recognizable in my little Kensington house of 1913. The other point to make is that this building type was used for absolutely everything, not just family life, but for manufacturing, warehouses, office work, shops, eating, drinking, almost everything, in fact. This set of slides shows you a famous area of the inner East End of London, Spitalfields, which was particularly famous for a centre for weaving, silk weaving from about 1700 onwards. That very bashed about house on the right in the centre has the typical weaving windows which you get in the attics of these houses, and these houses were used systematically right through the 18th century till the late 20th century for textile trades. On the top left you see an engraving by Hogarth showing the looms set up in one of these attics in Spitalfields. On the lower left, a rather interesting picture of Bangladeshi workers, a different set of immigrants still in these houses in the 1960s. And going back to the photograph of the exterior again, that house in the center has actually become a cafe, whereas the two left and right are still in the hands of the textile trades. But if you went to Spitalfields today, what you would see is it's completely repopulated by middle class people with plenty of money, turning them back into family houses. So turning back to the business about the kind of the way these houses were used for everything, when you think about it, most European cities had little in the way of specialized building types before the 19th century. In London, the terrace house type was the standard for almost all activities, and to an extent it still is. As we've been reminded during the lockdown, houses fit many kinds of work perfectly well, and office work most of all. So when people say they need enormous floor plates in a city in order for people to do their work in great new buildings of that kind, I'm quite skeptical about it. So please do not fall, and this is one thing I want to emphasize, for one widespread misconception. That is to suppose that London terrace houses were occupied only by single families in family. Certainly houses of the kind were usually built with the aspiration that they would be taken by a single family who would live there permanently, with servants in the basement and the attics and the family in between, in what is often called an upstairs downstairs arrangement. These two pictures are kind of memorials of a very famous BBC TV series of the 1970s, which showed the conventional idea of the terrace house, a rich family living in the middle floors with the servants in the basements and the attics at the top. You could really work down, you could see at the top on a section, those are going to be the servants' rooms in the top, then the children's rooms next down, then the master bedroom on what they call the second floor, drawing rooms on the first floor, and the dining room and reception rooms and the staircase on the ground. So that's the conventional view of the matter, and it's one which, of course, nostalgic British historians love to cherish. Many houses were indeed occupied in that way, especially in the smart districts, but even there, London terrace houses were often taken on the short term for a year or more and then redecorated and reoccupied. Society was much more mobile then, interestingly, than it is today. Elsewhere, it was as common as not for houses never to be occupied by a single family, but to be broken up and let by the floor from the start, in fact, for them to be occupied as so-called lodgings or flats. Often, too, houses began in single occupation, but soon became multi-occupied when the original families moved on to newly fashionable districts. Multi-occupation of houses is often taken as a sign of social decline. Sometimes that's right, but in many districts it was the norm. Probably, I would guess, the majority of London houses were always occupied by more than one family. The kinds of houses I've been talking about were cheap to build, with thin walls, almost nothing in the way of services besides a few fireplaces. The best they would sometimes get is water in cisterns, outside cisterns in the basements, at least in the 18th century. Running water inside houses is really an early 19th century change. Their reputation generally and internationally was low, and they only really began to attract admiration, I find this rather an interesting point, during the high tide of the modern movement, when minimalism was in vogue and architects were getting interested in housing for the masses, not just for the wealthier classes. The classic texts which put the London terrace house on the map are two famous books which I think I put on the reading list. You see them here. On the left, the Danish architect Steen, Eiler, Rasmussen's London, the Unique City of the 1930s, and on the right, John Summerson's Georgian London of 1945. The Summerson text is still fairly widely read, I think, and I've deliberately put on this slightly scruffy copy because it belonged to my mother, who bought it soon after it came up. It was very widely read, this book, one of the books of architectural history in Britain, which has really been read across a wide spectrum, which is quite interesting. The Summerson book, which is really very readable, was the first to analyze the London house type with any precision. But don't suppose that Summerson, who was a discriminating and slightly aristocratic kind of a person, really admired this type as architecture. What he respected it more in a slightly left-wing Marxist way as a good minimal mechanism for housing the vast expansion of London, which was going on in the 18th and 19th century. Well, perhaps I've talked more than I should about the minimalism of the London house, and you'll want to get away from that a bit, as better off Londoners, of course, wanted to from the mid-18th century at least. One way, as I mentioned, to get away from this monotony was to group these very ordinary houses in some kind of overall classical composition. That didn't happen much before about 1770, when the famous Adam brothers took up terrace houses for the rich, grouped them in overall compositions, like you see at the Adelphi at the top, which is the last gone, and did fascinating things with their interiors. And in a way, almost more interesting, the Adelphi is this little group of houses in a street called Mansfield Street in the West End. If you look at that plan carefully, you can see you're actually looking at 4 terrace houses, 4 rather large houses, each with different plans. And the Adams did brilliant things behind these rather plain but austere and well-proportioned facades. Wonderful plaster decoration of their own kind, and wonderful spatial effects, like you get a little bit of a sense from that little kind of domed staircase in the center there. These kind of unified compositions, which I've just been talking about, like the Adelphi, became a feature of some, not all, of London squares. And the best preserved example is this one, Bedford Square. And in fact, it's where the famous Architectural Association is based today. Later, in the early 19th century, another well-known architect, John Nash, designed his scenic terraces around Regent's Park, which pretend to be palazzos, a bit like the Inigo Jones business in Covent Garden, but in fact they're just, again, they're groups of houses. But notice that by Nash's time, the dull stop brick was commonly covered with stucco. In the next phase, after about 1825, houses in this stucco style acquired some Italian type enrichment and went up in huge numbers, each one now having its own portico. The famous exponent of this manner, who Salomons referred to, was the builder Thomas Cubitt, who built swathes of what is still London's wealthiest quarter, Belgravia, just behind Buckingham Palace. Also, much of the less fashionable Pimlico on the other side of Victoria Station. If you want to stay in a cheap hotel near Victoria, you may very well end up in this area. This so-called Italianate way of building, that's what it tends to be called in England, went on in much the same way for about 50 years. The only main change between about 1825 and 1875, the only main changes being that brick came back for the fronts, as you see on the right, kind of lighter brick, leaving only the porches and dressings in stucco. Bay windows, as you can see from the houses on the left, also start to appear, and with the porticos, help to give a touch of movement to the fronts, which are otherwise rather blank. Acres of Kensington, which I referred to earlier, are built in this rather pompous and repetitive style. It's actually the style of Victorian respectability, and the romantic writers, the avant-garde people of the time, the romantic writers, hated these houses. They found them tall and inexpressive on the outside and dull and gloomy on the inside. I thought I'd just give you a couple of quotations here. Famous poem by Alfred Lord Tennyson in memory of a friend of his. He talks about the dark house by which once more I stand here in the same unlovely street very much like Harley Street. And referring to Harley Street itself, Charles Dickens has this as a quotation: "The opposing rows of houses in Harley Street were very grim with one another, all to be knocked at and rung at in the same form, all approachable by the same dull steps, all fended off by the same pattern of raying, all with the same impracticable fire escapes, and everything to be taken at a high valuation." And if you're interested in the literary approach to this kind of world, Dickens, another novel of Dickens, Dombey and Son, is all about the desperately awful life of a rich man and his 2 children, rich widow, in one of these houses. They're introspective kind of houses, and with their continual up and downs, not particularly convenient actually. The main thing to be said in their favour is that the different levels were good for privacy. The flats then, after about 1875 at last comes a sharp break. Later perhaps than in most European cities, middle-class flats start to be built in London, and quite in increasing numbers. 2 reasons can be given for this rather slow take-up. One is that the first purpose-built flats in London were for the working classes, so that they tend to be associated with poverty. The picture on the left is left bottom is of that kind of flats. And there may be something in that theory. The other theory is that Londoners were used to living in an upstairs, downstairs way and didn't like living horizontally. I don't think that's right, because once these flats started to be built, they were very quickly taken up. And as I was saying earlier, many houses had already been occupied by the floor. The real reason, I believe, for the slow appearance of flats was the structure of the London building industry. It'd be very interesting to compare with other European cities in this respect. Building a block of flats obviously requires more capital, because the whole block has to be finished before a single unit can be sold. So you need much better financing from the start. Under the old terrace system, when you're going along left to right, as it were, the houses could be completed and occupied one at a time. So the whole method of building was much simpler. There were other reasons as well for the decline of the London terrace house, particularly in the middle and upper classes. One was the flight to the suburbs once public transport became available. In the outer suburbs, you could have more space and perhaps occupy an independent villa with garden all around. In the inner suburbs, the houses separate and begin to get narrow gaps between them again, like in the old villages, a rather interesting recurrence. And that favors a special English type called the semi-detached. I know that you got them in continental Europe, but they're not so common early on, I think. This is a kind of, in origin, I suppose, a kind of snobbish attempt to make it look as if a house is a large detached one, whereas in reality it's divided into two units. So it's a clever kind of marketing device, if you like. At the bottom, you see some really beautiful, early and handsome examples of the semi-detached type. You could easily be fooled into thinking these were individual houses, but they're not. Each is divided into two. That's a crescent at Blackheath in South London called the Paragon. Up the top, much commoner later kind of picture where you get what is almost a row of terraces, but the one on the left is actually independent so-called villa with a tiny sliver of space between it and the next two, which are semi-detached. So it's just breaking up the terrace a little bit. After 1875, I think an important date, various reforms take place to the planning and appearance of the London house. And I would argue that the following 40 years, which are the ones I've been working on in my book at the moment, show British housing at its best. Here, for instance, is a remarkable example of how one clever architect named Ernest George took the continuous urban block by the scruff of the neck and translated it into a series of essays in individualism, based, as you can see, on the traditional townhouses of Belgium, Holland, and Germany. Very interested he was in Northern Europe, went to sketch it. In a way, it's an attempt to save the terrace house for the upper classes by making it more individual again. These houses, as you can see from the little plan at the top right here, do all have party walls, so you can call them terrace houses if you like, but each has got a plan of its own. And rather importantly, they don't have the scruffy back extensions, which the ordinary London terrace houses. The fronts are as good as the back. So the old accusation which used to be said about the terrace houses, they were Queen Anne in front and Mary Anne behind, meaning they're like servants' quarters behind, isn't true anymore. And the back elevations of these houses, which you see on the right bottom here, are just as important as the fronts. This is a set of houses I very much admire, beautiful things. Colliam Gardens, which you're seeing here, is in Kensington, which is still a pretty urban district in feeling. To appreciate the changes in London housing that take place in the late 19th century, we have to go further afield, away from the centre. Bedford Park, which you're seeing here in West London, is architecturally the most rewarding of the many middle-class railway suburbs, as they're so called. The general style of the houses is red brick with white paint, completely different from the heavy stuccoed stuff I've been showing you. The style is generally called Queen Anne for reasons too complicated to explain, I think. Most of these Bedford Park houses are small independent villas, bottom right, or semi-detached houses, top right. There are a few rows of terraces too, but they aren't predominant. And none of them has any basements. The whole development here was deliberately made to avoid basements, which got damp. And if there were problems with sewers and drainage, which there frequently were until London was drained very impressively in the 1860s and 70s. The basements of earlier terrace houses could be absolutely appalling. Dark, damp, and altogether miserable. Lower down the social scale, the terraces roll on after 1875, usually in the form of small two-story houses, of which you see a couple of examples here. Again, no basements. Most are built by speculative builders, but there are various suburban estates of such houses built by reforming bodies, which tend to have a more coherent look. Here we go. Most of the reform housing built in London in Victoria had concentrated on the centre and took the shape of blocks of flats planned to promote better sanitation and health. I'm not going into those now. But they did their job, but housing reformers generally felt that individual suburban houses were a much better solution. The problem was that working class people needed to live close to their work in the centre of London because the costs of transport were so high. That's why there weren't more of the estates like this. But a few successful attempts were made to build large estates of small terrace houses, like those you see here, top Shaftesbury Park in Battersea, which is southwest of the centre, and a rather more architectural, as you can probably see from the red brick, more later development called Noel Park, which is mostly the 1880s to the northeast. Rather interestingly, Noel Park was not very successful because of the issue of the working classes not being able to afford the fares to go to it. Even small houses like these were often multi-occupied, with one family on the ground floor and another upstairs, an arrangement which often created social frictions. By a development which hasn't really had all the notice it should have. After 1890, you begin to find houses at this low scale, just 2 stories, with pairs of front doors if you look carefully. In other words, these are really flats, with one front door opening straight onto a staircase leading upstairs to the upper dwelling, and the other into a ground floor flat. Houses of this kind are common in the London suburbs between about 1890 and 1910. They're usually called cottage flats. They show that there was a strong demand among the working classes for small, completely independent units, not for complete houses. They're a kind of compromise, if you like. The 1890s also marked the start of the special form of municipal housing, which flourished in Britain right up until Mrs. Thatcher put a stop to it in the 1980s. By this method, the local authorities built housing themselves, mostly using their own teams of architects, rather than delegating the work to independent societies, as usually happened in most European cities. The major housing authority in London at the time was the London County Council. Its architects began by building blocks of flats for the working classes. The earliest and most famous example was the Boundary Estate, which you see here in the East End. The fine appearance of this scheme shows the influence of the arts and crafts movement on the LCC's architects. It's often remarked that this is the best municipal housing ever built, rather like the Gutenberg Bible being the first example of printing and the best. Very interesting little paradox. But in fact, this scheme that was very expensive to build and not a complete social success, because the poor tenants who had to be got rid of in order to build this, who'd been living on the site before, were displaced in favor of more prosperous artisans, the upper working classes, who could afford the rents for the new housing. For this kind of reason, and because, as I said, the housing reformers thought suburban houses were better, the LCC, the London County Council architects and other officials preferred to build lower cost estates of houses in the suburbs, connecting them with subsidised trams. And this is what they mainly did after 1900, as here on the Totterdown estate in Tooting. The results, of course, are much less impressive architecturally, probably better housing. Some of these units, as you can see in the little picture of the opening at the top right, are cottage flat types of the kind I showed you with 2 front doors. Generally, these houses are grouped in short runs of terraces with generous gardens at the back. So the terrace house still exists, but it's broken into small units. And the gardens are also not just for growing flowers in, you're supposed to grow your vegetables in. So self-sufficiency in vegetable gardens is an important ideal of the housing in England around that 1900. To complete my story, I'd like to end with Hampstead Garden suburb. Internationally, perhaps this is the most housing ever built in London, and I think it doesn't get enough attention today. Its main planner and designer, Raymond Unwin, fervently believes in the individual English house with its garden as the key to the health and happiness of all classes. But unlike most English architects with their kind of chauvinist and natural reflex, Unwin was very aware of planning developments in other countries, most of all Germany. So Hampstead Garden suburb can be interpreted as London's only example of the fully planned city extension of the type that you find in, for instance, Berlage's Amsterdam South. But the housing, of course, is quite different, partly because it's earlier, planned from 1907 onwards, partly because Unwin had no love for the urban house form or for very geometrical urban housing layouts. And many things about Hampstead Garden suburb are revolutionary, and I don't have the time to go into them all. But among them, I would just say, since we've been talking about the planning of the organization of the individual house as opposed to its wider planning, squares and things, among them is the internal planning of these houses, which almost all without back extensions. In fact, I think they all are without back extensions. I really would recommend you, if any of you are interested in these kinds of things, to have a look at Unwin's Town Planning in Practice. It's a kind of brilliant book with an international perspective, and it really could do with being reprinted. This scheme at Hampstead had a vast and almost immediate influence beyond Britain. First of all, in Germany, in 1913, they were already building garden suburbs in Germany, and rather later in Belgium, Holland. You see a couple of examples here, Vreeswijk in Rotterdam, and Cité Floréal in Brussels, and even France and Italy with their kind of more Latin cultures took it up to some degree. Unwin takes us far from the London Terrace house, and I must wrap up. To repeat, London has no monopoly on the row house. It doesn't even, I think, have the most architecturally stimulating houses of the genre of the fantastic kind you find, for instance, in Art Nouveau Brussels or Antwerp. You can find the odd example of the townhouse being built in London today. The picture on the bottom right are some brick ones that have just been built quite close to where I live, compared to a scheme in one of the Amsterdam suburbs next to it. But I don't think that all London townhouses being built than in any other European city, as far as I'm aware. And I freely would say that British housing today simply doesn't compete in housing quality with the best of what has been built in the Netherlands for many decades now. For reasons which are ultimately political, our planning system and indeed our local government system in Britain are regrettably close to collapse, which is why you find in the central London of today the kind of horrors going up, which would never be allowed in the centre of Paris or Amsterdam. There are many reasons for it. We can perhaps discuss them. All the same, as I said at the start, I'm a kind of London patriot and therefore a kind of London optimist. My city is just too big and too various to destroy. If I've given you any reason to be intrigued by it, I shall feel I've done enough. Come and explore, and whatever you do, get away from the West End and the city, because there's much more to London than that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrew, for the talk. A wonderful way to conclude our series. I believe a few of our students have some questions, so the floor is yours. Ryan?
Hi, thank you for the lecture. I'm quite interested in the earlier image that you show that there is an infill of shop function in front of the terrace house. It's kind of unplanned, And is it legal to do that in London? And what's its impact to the neighborhood of the shops in the neighborhood? And what are your comment to that development?
Are you talking about the picture I showed quite early on, which shows some terrace houses set back and single-story shops in front? Yeah, that was something which was going on pretty much without regulation. I think mostly between about 1870 and 1914. It's not happened since.
Oh.
So it would be discouraged by the planning authorities now. But it's quite amusing, but it's quite horrific as well, in a way.
Thank you.
Another question? Matthew, I'm sure you have one.
Yes, of course. Well, thank you for the lecture. It's very nice to hear a voice from home. I'm currently in the middle of probably the longest stretch outside the UK. So yes, it's very nice to see some familiar streets. So in the reading that we were set, there's a link formed between the speculative builders and the sort of lower quality maybe or lower standard of houses. And in this lecture series, we've learned a lot about how speculative builders are very closely related to the United Kingdom's real estate laws. And sort of the system today, as you mentioned at the end, is much unchanged. Sometimes it's the very same families who are involved in the building process, like the Grosvenors, or you now have the sort of new mass building companies like Bovis or Barrett or Berkeley Homes. That's just the Bs. And they're still building these sort of quite low quality homes. So my question is, do you think it's possible to sort of improve the quality of mass house building in the UK? And is it possible without having to sort of entirely reform the real estate laws and therefore have to take on these sort of very powerful house builders?
Well, when one gets a question like that, one immediately says "good question," which means I can't answer it. I think there is a long tradition, which I think you're referring to, of kind of minimal building, because that cheapens the houses and makes them more marketable, if you like. And I think it's extremely difficult at this particular stage in, whether you call it late capitalism or whatever you call it. I mean, the market economy is much stronger than it was, shall we say, in the 1960s or something like that. So it's very difficult to be optimistic about any big change of that nature. And of course, with property values not ceasing to rise despite the drama over the last year or so, I've seen no signs of it dropping. It's unlikely that one's going to see houses are already pretty unaffordable, and there's going to be very little incentive for them to build more expensive ones. And what happens, as I'm sure you know, and I don't know whether other people watching know, is that developers now are requested, perhaps this happens in many European countries as well, when they have a big development, to put in a number of so-called affordable units along with the more luxurious flats they're building, which they can make more money on, and they always try and resist this as far as they can. So yes, it could only be changed by stronger laws of one kind or another. And with the current government we've mostly had in Britain since the millennium, that's unlikely to change, I think. I think I've not read the latest statistics, but I think it's true that English people used to think they had better housing than on continental countries in terms of space standards. I think in the 1960s this was probably true, but the reverse is now the case, which is a very regrettable thing. Of course, one aspect of everything to do with housing, whether it's in Britain or whether it's on the continent, which I think architects don't often think enough about, is that a decreasing proportion of the total cost of all buildings, whether they're housing or offices, well, those are the two main things, is spent on the fabric and the carcass, because more is poured into the services. So that's always a consideration. And the first demand is always for better services rather than more durable carcass, if you could say, for the buildings.
Thank you very much.
Does somebody else have a question? Maybe Art, do you have?
Yes, I'd love to. First of all, great to have you here in Delft. Without having you here, I'm very sorry about that. Wonderful to meet again. And thank you for this great insight in, well, what you could call the bread and butter of London building. And it's great. It's very fascinating to see how much, in the end, variation there is. I have a very basic question. I've seen some of them. You've showed me some of them. Where does the word terrace come from? In the Netherlands and in many other languages or cultures, we use terrace as a word for an open space connected to a house or a cafe or in a park. How is it that it became connected to a housing development in London?
Do you know, Art, I used to know the answer to this and I've forgotten it, but I think it's a kind of marketing thing. It always sounded rather fashionable and grand in the 17th century when these houses was first starting to be built. There was a development I know in Kensington called the Terrace, as the only one, I think, which was marketed to some degree because it had a lot of open space either in front or behind, and gradually the whole thing caught on from there. But it's not, you're right to talk about it because it's a curiosity, really, isn't it? The American term rojas is much more accurate, but many words in housing do, I think, come from the world of pretentious marketing when you start to look at them carefully.
Could it be because you showed Adelphi Terrace that indeed has a large terrace?
A terrace on, yes.
Could that be an original origin of the term? Or?
Started before that, but it will be interesting. You may be very well right. It may have popularized it a lot. I don't know the answer to that. It's quite likely, I think.
Thank you.
Is there another question from one of the students?
Can I ask?
Of course.
I have a question about cottage flat houses with two doors. It is interesting to hear if it somehow changed the relationship between neighbors, as they're like in the same house and share something like a garden, a courtyard. So if it's also changed their communication between neighbors.
Well, I would imagine it did. I don't have an evidence for that, but obviously, if you're sharing a house and you don't have any divisions, any structural divisions between it, social frictions can, and it's well documented, they very frequently arise, often about the use of the common areas and who cleans them, and about rubbish collection and things of this kind. If you've got a complete division, which of course is not, communitarians don't like that so much, but if you've got a complete division, you get a more efficient kind of family life, I think, usually. I think there's a certain amount of sociological comment on that. I mean, what is rather interesting about those cottage flats, so-called, which I made a bit of a point of, is that they're very popular, but only for a short period. They don't recur again after the First World War. And the reason for that, as far as I'm aware, is I'm talking now just about Britain. I'd be interested to know whether they happen in many continental countries, is that Unwin, who I didn't have time to say, after Hampstead Garden Suburb, became the most influential theorist and bureaucrat, really, in reforming English housing after the First World War. He was very much against that form of cottage flat. He didn't like them at all. So they disappeared quite fast under his influence, I think. But I'd be interested to know whether anybody can say, are there many types of houses of that nature in continental Europe?
Good question. I do know that Unwin was quite influential, and an influence that went quite far. In fact, just this summer I was in, maybe a bit of a curious example, in Wolfsburg in Germany, which was a city built for the Volkswagen factory by the Nazis. And they made a housing estate, which, well, I hate to say it, but it's almost as beautiful as Hampstead Garden suburb. So it was extremely influential right up till the Second World War, and maybe even still after. But so it was known, Unwin, and it was influential.
It's I mean, the influence of Unwin on Germany is very big. Ernst May, who was in the Unwin office for a short time, about 1910, when he was a young man, and there are other examples. And he kept in touch. I mean, the First World War was a cultural disaster in so many ways, apart from all the lives. But it destroyed the closer links which were being made between Britain, certainly, and Germany culturally in the period. And in the 1920s and 30s, you hardly find anybody in the world of architecture who's interested in Germany at all because of the effects of the First World War. Mm. It's a kind of rather like the Brexit thing. It's the First World War pushes British culture back on itself and makes it more chauvinistic, when it was becoming less so in the 10 years before the First World War, and perhaps a little bit longer.
Also, a kind of cottage flat exists in some Greek suburbs as well.
Oh, how interesting. Interesting. I would have thought there must be parallels in other European countries. Thank you for telling me that.
Well, thank you, Andrew, for the very lovely and considered talk. It was a pleasure. So, well, we hope at another moment there's a opportunity to bring you to Delft and the Berlage in person and the Faculty of Architecture. So at any rate, thank you again, and we give you a round of applause for a great talk and a wonderful contribution to conclude the series. A lot of food for thought. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I've enjoyed doing it.